The year is 1801, and a Presbyterian minister named James McGrady stands before a crowd of 10,000 people in rural Kentucky. They've traveled for days, some walking barefoot for over 100 miles, sleeping in tents and crude shelters, all to attend what would become known as the Cane Ridge Revival. For 6 days straight, people wept, shouted, fell into trances, and experienced what they described as direct encounters with the divine. Men and women who couldn't read suddenly began quoting scripture. Hardened frontiersmen collapsed in tears. The event was so intense that witnesses reported you could hear the collective sobbing and praying from miles away. This wasn't just a religious service. This was the Second Great Awakening, and it fundamentally transformed American society, reshaping politics, education, social reform movements, and the very fabric of American identity. Now, 220 years later, as we stand in 2025 watching our world fracture along ideological lines, watching institutions crumble and trust evaporate, watching people desperately search for meaning in an age of information overload and spiritual drought, the question isn't whether another great awakening will happen. The question is, what will it look like when it does? To understand where we're going, we need to understand what a great awakening actually is. These aren't just periods of increased church attendance or fleeting religious enthusiasm. They're seismic shifts in collective consciousness that reorganize society from the ground up. The First Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s wasn't just about Jonathan Edwards preaching sinners in the hands of an angry God to terrified congregations. It created the very concept of American individualism, the idea that each person could have a direct relationship with the divine without intermediaries. This theological revolution planted the seeds for political revolution. When colonists started believing they didn't need bishops to access God, it became much easier to believe they didn't need kings to govern themselves. The Second Great Awakening, that explosion of religious fervor from roughly 1790 to 1840, did something even more remarkable. It took a young, fragmented nation barely held together and gave it a sense of moral purpose. But here's what most people miss. The revival meetings were just the visible surface. Underneath, the Second Great Awakening created the American university system, with schools like Oberlin College founded specifically to train revival preachers. It birthed the modern social reform movement. Abolition wasn't a political movement first, it was a religious one, driven by people who attended camp meetings and became convinced that slavery was incompatible with Christian faith. The temperance movement, women's suffrage, prison reform, mental health advocacy, all of these emerged from the spiritual soil of the Second Awakening. The Third and Fourth Great Awakenings are more contested among historians, but most scholars point to the social gospel movement and progressive era from 1890 to 1920 as the third, and the explosion of evangelicalism from the 1960s through the 1980s as the fourth. Each one responded to a specific crisis: industrialization and inequality, the cultural upheaval of the 60s, the perceived moral decay of modern society. And each one reshaped America in ways that still affect us today. But here's where it gets fascinating. Every Great Awakening has followed a pattern, and we're seeing that exact pattern emerge right now. The sociologist William McLaughlin identified 5 stages: a period of cultural distortion and stress, a period of religious revitalization, a period of cultural transformation, a period of new cultural consensus, and finally gradual decline until the next cycle begins. Where are we now? Deep in stage 1, arguably transitioning into stage 2. Consider the markers of stage 1. Institutional distrust at historic highs. A 2023 Gallup poll found that only 16% of Americans have confidence in newspapers, 8% in Congress, and trust in organized religion has dropped from 68% in 1975 to just 31% today. We're watching the collapse of meta-narratives, the grand stories that used to organize society. The American dream, the inevitable march of progress, the benevolence of technology, all crumbling. Young people are experiencing what researchers call meaning crisis at unprecedented rates. A 2024 study from the University of Pennsylvania found that 67% of Americans under 30 report feeling that life has no clear purpose. and 54% say they feel disconnected from any sense of transcendent meaning. But simultaneously, and this is crucial, we're seeing an explosion of spiritual seeking outside traditional channels. The global wellness industry is worth $6.3 trillion. Meditation apps have been downloaded over 400 million times. Psychedelic therapy is being fast-tracked through FDA approval. People aren't becoming less interested in transcendence, they're desperately hungry for it. They're just looking in new places. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below because I'm genuinely curious about who's thinking about these questions and where in the world you're located. And if you're enjoying this deep dive and want to see more content like this on Professor Archive, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us create these longer, more researched videos. So, what could the next Great Awakening actually look like? Let's start with what it almost certainly won't be: a repeat of Cane Ridge. There won't be mass camp meetings in rural Kentucky, though the form might echo in different ways. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and the rhyme scheme is becoming audible. The first major characteristic will be decentralization. Previous awakenings had epicenters, charismatic leaders, defining moments. The first had George Whitefield, whose voice was so powerful that Benjamin Franklin calculated he could preach to 30,000 people without amplification. The second had Charles Finney, whose new measures of revival technique were so controversial and effective that he converted entire cities. The fourth had Billy Graham, who preached to 215 million people in person during his lifetime. The next awakening won't have a Billy Graham. It will have 10,000 micro-influencers, each with their own following, their own interpretation, their own hybrid spirituality. We're already seeing this. Look at the explosion of spiritual content on TikTok, where the hashtag spirituality has over 89 billion views. These aren't slick television evangelists. They're 20-somethings in their bedrooms talking about shadow work, ancient wisdom, deconstructing religious trauma, and reconstructing personal faith from the pieces. The technology writer Venkatesh Rao calls this the fragmentation of the sacred. Where previous awakenings created new denominations and institutions, the next awakening will create what we might call spiritual scenes. Loose networks of people who share practices and beliefs but resist formal organization. Think about how cryptocurrency and blockchain technology have created economic networks without central banks. The next awakening will create spiritual networks without central authorities. Second characteristic, syncretism on a scale we've never seen. Every previous awakening borrowed and blended. The Second Great Awakening mixed African spiritual practices with Protestant Christianity in ways that scandalized traditionalists but created vibrant new forms of worship. But they were constrained by geography and available knowledge. The next awakening has the entire global spiritual tradition available on demand. A person in Ohio can wake up and do Kundalini yoga from a teacher in India via YouTube, listen to a podcast about Stoic philosophy while driving to work, attend a sound healing session using Tibetan singing bowls at lunch, and end the day reading about Christian mysticism. And they won't see any contradiction in this because the framework isn't choose one religion. The framework is cultivate wisdom from all sources. This drives traditional religious leaders absolutely crazy, and understandably so. It looks like spiritual consumerism, like building a designer religion from a menu of options, and sometimes it is. But something deeper is happening. The religious scholar Mircea Eliade talked about how humans are inherently homo religiosus, intrinsically religious beings. When traditional religions fail to provide what people need, they don't become secular. They become creative. They start building their own sacred canopies. Here's a concrete example that's already happening. In 2019, a group in Brooklyn started something called the Sanctuaries, a network of spaces that host what they call ecumenical ecstatic experiences. One week it's a cacao ceremony with live music and guided meditation. The next week it's contemplative prayer in the Christian tradition. The week after that, it's ecstatic dance. The same people attend all of it. When interviewed, participants don't say they're trying different religions. They say they're accessing the sacred through different doorways. Similar groups have emerged in over 40 cities worldwide. The third characteristic will be the integration of technology and transcendence in ways that would have been unimaginable even 20 years ago. And this is where things get really strange and really interesting. In 2023, researchers at Johns Hopkins conducted a study where they had participants use virtual reality during meditation sessions. The VR created immersive sacred spaces, Gothic cathedrals, ancient temples, natural landscapes. They found that 68% of participants reported the experience as more spiritually meaningful than meditation in physical spaces. 14% described it as among the most profound spiritual experiences of their lives. Or consider this. In 2024, a developer created an AI trained on the writings of mystics across traditions. Rumi, Hildegard of Bingen, Ramakrishna, Thomas Merton, the Desert Fathers. Users can have conversations with this AI about their spiritual struggles and receive guidance synthesized from this mystical corpus. Over 3 million people have used it. Now, traditionalists will correctly point out that this isn't a real spiritual director, that it lacks the human wisdom and discernment of a living teacher. They're right. But for millions of people who have no access to spiritual directors, who've been hurt by religious institutions, or who are exploring outside their inherited traditions, it's a starting point. Here's where it gets even more provocative. Psychedelics. The data on this is becoming impossible to ignore. Johns Hopkins, NYU, and Imperial College London have all conducted rigorous studies showing that psilocybin, when used in therapeutic contexts, produces experiences that participants describe in mystical terms. In one study, 67% of participants rated the experience as among the top 5 most meaningful of their entire lives, on par with the birth of a child or the death of a parent. These aren't fringe findings. This is peer-reviewed research in prestigious institutions. And it's escaping the lab. Oregon legalized psilocybin therapy in 2020. Colorado followed in 2022. Several other states are in process. But beyond legal frameworks, there's been an explosion of underground facilitation networks, people, often with therapy backgrounds, guiding others through psychedelic experiences with explicit spiritual framing. Some draw on indigenous traditions. Others blend Eastern meditation practices with depth psychology. Still others are creating entirely new frameworks. Now, I'm not advocating for or against this. I'm simply observing that millions of people are having experiences they describe as direct encounters with the divine. And these experiences are changing their lives in measurable ways. Studies show significant reductions in depression and anxiety, increases in prosocial behavior, greater sense of connection to others and to nature, and long-term changes in values and priorities. If that's not the raw material of a religious awakening, what is? But here's the crucial twist. Unlike previous awakenings which moved people toward orthodoxy and commitment to specific traditions, this is creating what we might call spiritual promiscuity, or more charitably, integral spirituality. People aren't having a born-again experience and joining a church. They're having profound experiences and starting to explore consciousness itself as sacred. They're becoming convinced that multiple traditions are pointing toward the same underlying reality. And that reality is accessible through various means. Meditation, psychedelics, prayer, nature immersion, breathwork, even extreme physical practices like ice baths and extended fasting. The fourth characteristic will be the complete collapse of the sacred-secular divide. Previous Great Awakenings reinforced this boundary. They sacralized certain spaces, times, and practices while leaving the mundane world mundane. The next awakening is headed in the opposite direction, toward the sacralization of everything. We're already seeing this in movements like sacred commerce, where business is treated as spiritual practice, or conscious consumption, where every purchase is evaluated on ethical and spiritual grounds, or the explosion of mindfulness, which has taken a Buddhist meditation practice and applied it to everything from eating to walking to washing dishes. Critics see this as the final triumph of capitalism, the commodification of the sacred itself. And again, there's truth to that. When Walmart sells mindfulness journals and Fortune 500 companies have meditation rooms, something has clearly been domesticated and commercialized. But something else is happening too. The idea that your work, your relationships, your daily activities are all potential sites of spiritual practice, that's actually a return to pre-modern consciousness. Medieval peasants didn't separate work and worship. Indigenous traditions don't have a word for religion because everything is sacred. Modernity created the sacred-secular split. The next awakening might heal it. Consider the rise of what sociologists call engaged spirituality. In 2023, over 40% of Americans under 40 reported that their spiritual practice directly informs their political activism. These aren't people going to church on Sunday and voting on Tuesday. These are people who see climate activism as spiritual practice, who frame social justice work in terms of collective healing, who describe their engagement with social media as shadow work for the culture. Greta Thunberg didn't use religious language, but millions of young climate activists describe their work in explicitly spiritual terms, as serving future generations, as honoring the earth as sacred, as participating in what some call the Great Turning. Here's a specific example that demonstrates this fusion. In 2022, a group called the Humanity Project started hosting what they call sacred activism retreats. Participants spend mornings in meditation and contemplative practice. Afternoons are devoted to learning about specific social issues, housing injustice, mass incarceration, environmental degradation. Evenings involve collective ritual to process the emotional weight of these issues and commit to action. Within 2 years, they've hosted over 15,000 participants across 12 countries. When researchers interviewed participants, they struggled to separate the spiritual from the political. One woman said, "I can't tell where my meditation practice ends and my activism begins. It's all the same thing, becoming more aware and responding to what you see." The fifth characteristic, and this might be the most controversial, will be the feminization and deinstitutionalization of spiritual authority. Every previous Great Awakening in America eventually created or strengthened institutions, churches, seminaries, publishing houses, denominations. These institutions were overwhelmingly led by men and perpetuated masculine models of hierarchy and authority. The next awakening is already showing a different pattern. Look at who's leading spiritual conversations online and in local communities. It's overwhelmingly women. Women create the meditation circles, the moon ceremonies, the discussion groups about spiritual books, the online communities exploring trauma and healing. This isn't accidental. Research shows that women are more likely to describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, more likely to synthesize multiple traditions, more likely to emphasize community and emotional connection over doctrine and hierarchy. And they're creating non-institutional structures, not churches with buildings and budgets and bylaws, but networks, gatherings that pop up and dissolve, online communities, temporary autonomous zones of the sacred. The organizational theorist Frederick Laloux might call these teal organizations, operating on principles of wholeness, self-management, and evolutionary purpose rather than hierarchy and control. Here's what this looks like on the ground. In Portland, a woman named Sarah, a former evangelical who left the church over its treatment of LGBTQ people, started inviting friends to her apartment for what she called dinner church. They'd cook together, eat together, and then spend 2 hours in open-ended spiritual discussion, sharing struggles, reading from various wisdom traditions, sitting in silence together. Within a year, the group had grown so much they had to split into 6 separate dinner churches across the city. There's no official leadership, no doctrinal statement, no membership, no budget. People come if it feeds them. They contribute what they can. The whole thing could dissolve tomorrow, or it could be the seed of something massive. Nobody knows, and nobody's trying to control it. Multiply that by 10,000, and you start to see the shape of something that isn't a movement in any traditional sense, but might be even more powerful because it's distributed, resilient, adaptive. Now, let's talk about the catalyst. Every Great Awakening had triggering events or conditions. The first emerged partly from the anxiety of colonial life and the need to forge a common identity. The second responded to the chaos and opportunity of the early republic. What will trigger the next one? We might already be watching it unfold. The COVID pandemic did something extraordinary to collective consciousness. For the first time in living memory, the entire world shared a common experience of disruption, mortality, isolation, and uncertainty. Millions of people were forced into an unplanned retreat, separated from their routines, their communities, their distractions, and a remarkable number of them reported profound shifts in perspective and priority. A 2022 global study found that 58% of people said the pandemic made them question their fundamental assumptions about life, and 42% said they had engaged with spiritual or existential questions more deeply than ever before. But the pandemic was just the accelerant. The fuel is deeper. What the philosopher John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis. We live in a world of unprecedented material abundance and technological capability, and yet rates of depression, anxiety, addiction, and suicide keep climbing, especially among young people. Something is profoundly broken in how we're making sense of existence. The old stories don't work anymore. The American dream is a punchline. Progress seems to be leading us toward climate catastrophe. Technology that promised to connect us has made us lonelier than ever. Expertise has been discredited. Truth itself seems negotiable. Into this vacuum, something will rush. It always does. The question is what? Here's a prediction that might sound wild, but is based on observable trends. The next Great Awakening will include a massive revival of enchantment, a re-sacralization of nature and cosmos. We're already seeing early versions. The explosion of interest in astrology isn't just superstition, though it includes that. It's a hunger for a cosmos that speaks to us, that has meaning and pattern and connection to human life. The rise of nature-based spirituality, forest bathing, rewilding, deep ecology, isn't just environmentalism. It's treating the natural world as inherently sacred, not as resource to be managed, but as presence to be honored. Scientists are inadvertently feeding this. The more we learn about the universe, the stranger and more wondrous it becomes. We've discovered that trees communicate through underground fungal networks, that octopi might be conscious in ways completely alien to mammalian consciousness, that the universe seems to be fine-tuned for life in ways that defy probability, that quantum mechanics reveals a reality far weirder than any ancient myth. As the physicist Freeman Dyson said, "The more I examine the universe and study the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known we were coming." This is creating space for what we might call post-secular enchantment, the recovery of wonder and mystery not in opposition to science but in dialogue with it. You see this in the work of people like Brian Swimme, a mathematical cosmologist who presents the story of cosmic evolution as sacred story, or Robin Wall Kimmerer, a botanist and indigenous wisdom keeper who writes about plants as teachers and kin. These aren't New Age fluff. These are serious thinkers with impeccable credentials who are recovering a sense of the sacred precisely through deep engagement with the natural world and scientific knowledge. Imagine a great awakening centered not on personal salvation but on collective transformation, not on escaping the material world but on re-enchanting it, not on human dominion but on human participation in a living cosmos. That would be genuinely new in the American context, and it might be exactly what's emerging. But there will be dark sides. There always are. The First Great Awakening created tremendous spiritual vitality, but also self-righteous judgment and social division. The Second Great Awakening birthed abolition, but also nativism and religious mania. The Fourth gave us the civil rights movement and the moral majority. Spiritual intensity can fuel compassion or fanaticism, often both simultaneously. The next Great Awakening will face unique dangers. The combination of digital media and spiritual seeking could create what we might call algorithmic tribalism, where people's spiritual journeys are subtly shaped by recommendation engines, optimizing for engagement rather than wisdom. We could see the rise of charismatic grifters who exploit spiritual hunger for profit and power. We're already seeing this with wellness influencers peddling expensive nonsense. with conspiracy theories wrapped in spiritual language with movements like QAnon that function as digital age millenarian cults. There's also the danger of what philosopher William James called healthy-mindedness pushed to pathological extremes. The emphasis on manifestation, positive thinking, and personal transformation can easily become victim-blaming, where systemic injustice is reframed as individual failure to maintain the right vibration. When everything is spiritualized, nothing is political. Problems that require collective action and structural change get reduced to individual healing and consciousness raising. And perhaps most concerning, the next Great Awakening could deepen rather than heal America's fractures. Previous awakenings eventually created shared language and common cause, but in an age of filter bubbles and algorithmic sorting, we might see divergent awakenings. Red state religious revival completely disconnected from blue state spiritual exploration, each convinced the other represents existential threat. Spiritual intensity without shared framework for truth-seeking could accelerate tribalism rather than transcend it. Yet there's reason for hope, and it comes from an unexpected place: the hunger itself. The very intensity of the meaning crisis, the desperation of the seeking, might create openness that previous generations lacked. When you're drowning, you don't worry about the religious affiliation of the person throwing you a rope. Young people today have grown up in a world of diversity. They're more comfortable with ambiguity, more suspicious of absolutism, more willing to hold paradox. This could create an awakening that's less dogmatic and more dialogical than anything we've seen. There are already glimpses of this. In 2024, a remarkable gathering happened in Northern California called the Council. Over 5,000 people from radically different spiritual traditions came together for a week. Evangelical Christians, Buddhist monks, Muslim Sufis, Jewish Kabbalists, indigenous wisdom keepers, psychedelic therapists, atheist meditators, neo-pagans, and everything in between. They weren't there to debate doctrine or convert each other. They were there to sit in circle and speak from the heart about the crises facing humanity and what wisdom their traditions offered. One participant, a Baptist pastor from Alabama, said something striking. "I came here convinced I had the truth and everyone else was wrong. But listening to a Lakota elder speak about the sacred hoop, I heard my own Jesus saying that I may be one. I don't know what to do with that yet, but I can't unhear it." That's the kind of transformation that could define the next awakening. Not abandoning tradition, but deepening it through encounter with others. The historian Arnold Toynbee observed that civilizations don't die from external conquest. They die from internal spiritual exhaustion, from losing the creative minority that can respond to challenges with imagination and vitality. America in 2025 feels exhausted. Our institutions are sclerotic. Our discourse is toxic. Our sense of shared purpose has evaporated. We're overdue for renewal, and renewal in American history has always been spiritual before it's political. So what would the next Great Awakening actually change? If we project forward based on how previous awakenings worked, we can make some educated guesses. First, it would create new institutions, not denominations necessarily, but new forms of organization and community. Maybe networks of local resilience hubs that combine practical mutual aid with spiritual practice? Maybe new educational models that integrate contemplative practice with academic learning? Maybe new economic experiments that try to embody sacred values of reciprocity and stewardship?